Hey, welcome back to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. One thing we have noticed in the community is the difficulty that a lot of people have in finding their best fit type. And this is just kind of a struggle in the Myers-Briggs community in general. I think in the Enneagram community, probably just about any type system where you are responsible for finding your best fit type, as opposed to say like DISC or Colby or some of the other ones where you take a test and then they tell you what you are, and you don't really get to tweak that very much. You just kind of have to trust. Strength Finder is the same way. You just kind of have to trust the results. But in systems like Enneagram and in Myers-Briggs, the test can be the beginning of the process. That can be like the first thing you do. And you can't really, quote unquote, trust the test results in the same way you can with these other systems, because they require a lot of self-reporting elements that may or may not have been biased based on like what you ate for lunch that day and whether or not you're feeling disgruntled because your stomach hurts or you got a lot of sleep, or maybe it's a time period in your life where you're acting very different than you used to act. So there are so many different factors that can go into the results you get with both Enneagram and Myers-Briggs, that when you're looking for your best fit type, it can be kind of a frustrating beginning of the journey. And I admire people who stick with it, because you instinctively know there's power here. You instinctively know that there's something really special that you can tap into as soon as you get that best fit type accurate or correct. But sometimes it takes a while. And so one of the things that we wanted to do is talk a little bit about the element of cognitive functions or the mental processes that come along with Myers-Briggs. We're going to focus in on Myers-Briggs in this particular podcast. And the cognitive function level, because whenever anybody writes into Personality Hacker and says, I'm having trouble finding my type, we always go, okay, we'll go to the cognitive functions, because the dichotomies, which are extrovert, introvert, EI, SN, TF, JP, introvert, extrovert, sensor, intuitive, thinker, feeler, judger, perceiver. There's a lot of power in those, but there's a lot of limitation too. It's really how your mind is wired that helps you figure out what your best fit type is by almost reverse engineering it, by going straight to those cognitive functions and then figuring out which of those functions are, sort of match up to which 4-letter code. So we want to focus in this particular episode on the decision-making, or what's technically called the judging processes. There's 4 of them, and we want to talk about some of the distinctions that they have with each other, because it can get really confusing which process you're using at which time. Like a lot of people struggle knowing if, say, they're an INFP or an INTP. Each of those personality types lead with very different functions, like very different decision-making or judging processes, but they look similar enough so that people aren't sure which process they're using. So we want to go a little bit into some of the quirks and phenomena of these decision-making processes to give you like one more leg up in the process of trying to figure out your type, which some of you might still be struggling with.
If you're a new listener and all of what Antonia just said sounds like a foreign language to you, there's some resources we have at Personality Hacker. If you go to personalityhacker.com, you can look up something called the CAR model, which is a great model that lays this out for you. It's a structure you can basically take your personality type and layer onto and figure out what she's talking about, your cognitive function. It's technically called a cognitive function stack. It's basically the order of mental processes you use in your life. And this is a really powerful model for you to basically see how your mind is wired, how you're learning information, how you're making decisions. So I would recommend that you may want to pause this, go get that reference point, because we're going to make it streamlined in this conversation. So it'd be really good for you to have that information before we continue to unpack this, so you're not lost as we talk about it. That's just as a recommendation. So I'm just going to tell a story here about our dynamic a little bit, and I think this will be a good jumping off point to get right into talking about this. We have this, Antonia and I, when we're out and about, we're married, we obviously have a business together, we have a child together, we do a lot of life together. So we're out and about. We might be driving along and we're hungry. It might be time for dinner at night and ready to get something to eat. Like, hey, what do you if you're in a relationship, you probably have this classic thing. Hey, what do you want to eat tonight? I don't know. What do you want to eat tonight? I don't know. What do you want to eat tonight? You go back and forth, and it's kind of both of you trying to make a decision about, especially if you're both perceivers, extroverted perceivers. It can be quite the round and round experience. And you're trying to make a decision. And oftentimes I'll be driving the car Antonia will be in the passenger seat. Piper, our 5-year-old, will be in the back, and we'll be talking about what to eat. And Antonia will make a reference. She's like, oh, look, there's a great Mexican place right there. And instantly, I'll turn on my right turn signal in my car, and I'll start to turn into the restaurant parking lot. And she's like, well, I didn't say I wanted to go to the Mexican restaurant. I was giving you a piece of information that there is a Mexican restaurant right there. And I'm like, well, why would you tell me that? Like, we're trying to decide where to eat. You make a gesture, you point to the right and say, hey, there's a Mexican restaurant right there. Why would you tell me that if that's not something that you are leaning toward or you would like to have happen or a desire of yours? And we realized after a lot of conversation that basically we're approaching a piece of information in a very different way. Antonia, as an ENTP, has her primary decision-making function is introverted thinking. Now, this is the co-pilot or auxiliary function in her cognitive function stack, or in the car model, it's her co-pilot. It's how she makes her decisions. It's all about, we've nicknamed it accuracy. It's all about making sense. It's about logical consistencies. It's about a lot of information. She can manage immense amount of information, almost in a random access way. So information is the currency that she uses to make decisions, obviously, her best decisions. Now, I'm an ENFP, so my co-pilot or auxiliary function is introverted feeling. It's all about how I feel about something that resonates with me. We've nicknamed this authenticity. What feels authentic for me? But when I'm out driving a vehicle, I'm actually often relying upon my what's called my 10-year-old or tertiary process, which is extroverted thinking. We've nicknamed this effectiveness. And so if you want to just contrast the difference between introverted thinking, which Antonia has as her co-pilot, and my extroverted thinking, which I have as my 10-year-old or tertiary process, a piece of information comes up. She makes a gesture to the right and says, we want to go. She says, there's a Mexican restaurant over here. That thinker part of me, that extroverted thinking part of me, that little 10-year-old part of me goes, oh, that piece of information is actionable. I need to take action on that, because remember, this is an extroverted thinking process. It's something that you take action on in the outside world. So immediately I start to take action. I start to turn right, and we start to have this maybe a little, not argument, but it's like, I was just giving that piece of information to you because that's what you would have wanted, just a random piece of information to make a better decision. And here I'm interpreting this as an actionable decision.
Right. And so what this story illustrates is a phenomenon that we've realized when you're looking at the decision-making or judging processes. And as Joel just hinted to 3 of them, there's 4 in total. There's extroverted feeling, what we call harmony, and that's what FJs will use as their basic way, like their prime way of making decisions. Then there's introverted feeling, which is what Joel was using, or authenticity, and that's for feeler perceivers in the system. Then there's introverted thinking, what we call accuracy, which is TPs like me. And then there's extroverted thinking, what we call effectiveness, which is what TJs use. But we don't just use one of them. We have almost like a polarity. So the opposites, also, the opposite process that you're used to making decisions also impacts you. So Joel was referencing both introverted feeling or authenticity and extroverted thinking or effectiveness because he has both of them in his stack. Whereas I have introverted thinking or accuracy, and I also have extroverted feeling or harmony. They're both in my stack, so I'm going to be influenced by both of them. So when you're trying to figure out what your type is, and you're just focused on which decision-making process you use, remember you're going to have a little bit of its polarity opposite in you too, helping you make your decisions. It's going to be part of what influences you. Even if it's what's called your 3-year-old or your inferior process, it's still going to be impacting you and influencing you. And when you're trying to just decipher all this stuff, right, like there's all these functions and now there's polarities and they're all influencing you. But we're kind of talking about the zoom out, right, like sort of the overview of all these processes in order to zoom in to one very interesting phenomena that Joel's story illustrates, which is if your decision-making or judging function is extroverted, so that's extroverted thinking or extroverted feeling, if you're using one of those two, then that makes that information or those emotions, if it's extroverted feeling, it makes it actionable, meaning that for extroverted thinking, all information is actionable, right? Information lives in the outside world, and the outside world is the world that we engage with and interact with. So information is actionable. If you're using an introverted judging process, like introverted thinking or introverted feeling, then it doesn't have to be actionable. It's just one more piece of the system. It's just one more thing. It's one more thing you need to know in order to get a complete picture. So if you're contrasting these directly against each other, and let's just use extroverted thinking and introverted thinking for a moment. If you're trying to figure out which one of these two you favor anywhere in your stack, ask yourself, do you believe that all information is actionable? Or do you think it's just one more data point that you're going to need to know in order to make a good decision later? So when I'm pointing out the Mexican restaurant, I'm not giving any preference, right? Like I'm not trying to indicate that this is what I want or we should be taking action on it. I'm pointing it out so it's a data piece that Joel can plug into his, like I'm assuming it's working like mine, right? Which is like a bunch of information. He can plug into his information system in order to weigh the pros and cons and figure out if he wants Mexican. If that's the case, and that's available right there, and maybe we drive down the street to see if there's anything else or any other availability. I'm just letting him know, hey, there's a data piece right there, and I'm sharing it with him because I would just want to know that piece of information. Whereas he thinks that information is instantaneously actionable, and so he starts to take motions towards it. So what is your relationship with information and data? Do you believe that you need to gather as much information as possible, just as random access data points, and then kind of, sort of mull through it and figure it out, and then eventually come up with something? Or do you believe that data is something that is always actionable, and so therefore you have to be careful with it? Because here's another thing that springs from this phenomena. I've noticed that people who use extroverted thinking don't share information as readily as people who use introverted thinking. And it's because if all information is actionable, then they're going to pick and choose what they choose to share with another person because they don't know if that's what they want that person to be doing. If they want to control the situation or if they want to control or influence the outcome, a person who uses extroverted thinking might actually withhold information because they don't want people to act on it. Whereas people who use introverted thinking, my observation has been that they are very free with information and data. The only time they withhold information is if they think the other person can't be responsible with it. Like if a piece of information or data is sensitive, and so they don't want that person passing it along for some reason. But other than that, people who use introverted thinking are usually very chatty about all the information going on in the world. And in fact, that's why they have a tendency to data dump, especially TPs, thinker perceivers. They have a tendency to give too much information to other people, and they kind of almost overwhelm them because information isn't actionable, but it is very vital to making good decisions. So they want to share that information with other people in order to help those people make the best decisions possible. So in trying to figure out which one that you use, kind of ask yourself, what's your relationship with information? Is it always actionable, or is it only actionable way later when you have all the information in front of you? And two, do you have a tendency to overshare information, thinking that other people are going to want it? Or do you have a tendency to be more sort of careful with how you dispense information, knowing people will act on it and wanting to influence how they're acting?
Yeah, we'll weave some of this together here in a little bit. But these are kind of the base, like the first tracks we're laying down of this to start weaving together how do you figure out your type. Now let's talk about a different set here. Let's talk about the feelings as judging functions and how you're making decisions in the world. So another story, we might be at home, Antonia and myself, and remember, I use a process. This is actually my strength in decision making, introverted feeling. It's all about all the intricate, deep, nuanced emotions going on inside of me at all times, and the things that are authentic to me, and inner alignment and identity and motivation. All these things are very important to me, right? So I'm living in this world of understanding all these nuances of emotion. So Antonia might come up to me. She might come up and she notices maybe I'm not doing so well, and she says, "Hey, how you feeling?" And I might give her some complex emotion, like, "Hey, I'm feeling sad," but it's not really sad. It's more of a nostalgic sadness that I'm feeling, and it's because of these reasons. And I just share that with her because I'm just sharing the emotional experience I'm having. And instantly, Antonia might start to get into action to help make me feel better. She might be like, "Oh, well, hey, let me make you some food," or "Why don't we go for a walk?" Or she'll try to maybe bring my mood up or help me get out of that space and I'm confused by this. I'm like, why are you getting into action to try to make me feel better? You asked me a question. I'm just sharing my emotions with you. There's no requirement on your side. In fact, I'm almost annoyed you're trying to make me feel better right now. I actually want to sit with this emotion. I want this to go ahead and process all the way through. And you're trying to almost distract me or try to talk me out of feeling this way or whatever your action is on this. And I'm confused at first. And we came down to it works very similarly to extroverted thinking versus introverted thinking. I'm just sharing an emotion. It's almost like for introverted thinking, a data set, this is an emotional set. I'm just giving you my raw emotions. And the more emotional nuance I figure that you have from me, the more you can better make a decision on how to interact with me. But when I send these emotions over to you, you have, again, your 10-year-old or tertiary process is extroverted feeling, which is the opposite of introverted thinking. So this is how you process emotions. It's actionable for you. You feel you need to do something about the emotions I'm sharing. So you might jump into action, and I'm confused. So this is the other end of this in our dynamic. And this is just an illustrative story to showcase how these two processes tend to work.
Yeah, just like with introverted thinking, introverted feeling feels like in order to truly understand, like have another person understand you, they're going to need to have as much, they're going to need to have as much access to your emotional experience as possible. As much
fidelity about your emotions as possible.
Right. And like with introverted thinking that wants to share a bunch of data points so you can make the best decision later, because you're going to want to plug this all through and kind of process it to figure it out later. Introverted feeling is very similar. Like you're going to want to know all of these nuanced emotional experiences in order to create intimacy and really know who I am as a person. And so I'm going to share all this with you in order to, in order to give you like the best bird's eye view of what's going on. Whereas with extroverted feeling, like you mentioned, again, it's like emotions are actionable because they always reference to extroverted feeling. Most things reference needs going unmet. To extroverted feeling, they just see the world filled with unmet needs. And so emotions are ways to have an arrow pointing at which need is going unmet. So for extroverted feeling, when somebody shares an emotion with you, you can train yourself over time to not necessarily immediately jump into action and want to like fix them or do something. But even if you're just like, oh, my job now is to listen to that person, it's still like, even if listening doesn't feel like an action, it's still an action because you feel like it's your job now to listen to that person and where they're at. So for extroverted feeling, it's always about taking an action when an emotion is, when an emotion is displayed. For introverted feeling, I've seen a lot of people who use introverted feeling watch another person go on a complete and total emotional tirade and just like sit there and observe them, right? And they're just observing their emotional experience because to introverted feeling, it's more fascinating than anything. It's more interesting. Now, it might make them feel bad if that person is an important person to them. They might end up, sympathizing with the other individual, but they don't necessarily feel like they have to do anything about it. They might just feel like, they might feel sympathy or they might feel heartbroken in their behalf or they might feel excited for them. But that doesn't necessarily mean that any specific action must be taken. But to extroverted feeling, there usually is, which is why extroverted feeling like goes to celebration, right? Oh, now I need to go celebrate this, or it goes to holding space, or it goes to getting you a hot cup of tea, or whatever it is that you need right now. Extroverted feeling is plugged into this. And so it's very, very corollary to how the extroverted thinking and introverted thinking processes work, but it's just in the domain of emotions as opposed to data.
And just like extroverted thinking may have reservations, they're reticent to share information because information to them is actionable. If you're talking to someone that uses extroverted feeling, we've nicknamed it harmony, they may be reticent to share their emotional experience because they don't want to put the burden of having to do something or to meet a need, which is what their experience would be. If you share your deepest, emotional experience with somebody, now you might have put a burden on them to have to solve something for you or meet your need. And so I think they can often, not all the time, but often hold back, especially with people they're not very intimate with, because they don't want to put that burden onto them.
Yeah. And similar with introverted feeling and introverted thinking, the time that introverted thinking withholds information is when they don't think the other person can be responsible with the data. And introverted feeling is similar. They won't share their emotions with another person if they don't trust that that person will be responsible with their emotional expression. And also, similar to introverted thinking is always looking for opportunities to teach or to give data. Introverted feeling is also always looking for opportunities to be self-expressive. If they can't communicate directly what their emotional experience is, they can at least maybe, create a piece of art or express it in their dress. So introverted feeling is actually quite forthcoming with emotions. They just do it in the form of self-expression, right? It's more about expressing who they are as a person, because introverted feeling, usually ends up, because it's so in touch with its emotional experience, it usually ends up being very in touch with its identity, or it's a concept of identity. So then it becomes about self-expression with identity, which all your emotional experiences basically form, right? All your subjective emotional experiences form your identity. And the same way with introverted thinking. Introverted thinking wants to data dump, it wants to teach. And if it doesn't have a context where it can do it, it oftentimes will find an outlet by, say, going online and making very long posts or forum posts or making blog posts or whatever. It's always looking for a way to teach data and information. It's almost like you got to get it outside of yourself. So whereas extroverted thinking and extroverted feeling might actually hold back on sharing those things because they think it's all actionable, the ones who use these processes in an introverted way almost feel a sense of having to get it outside of themselves into the outside world. And so they're oftentimes actually a lot more offering of those experiences, but of course how it strikes them as an individual. Whereas with extroverted thinking and extroverted feeling, when they're offering of those experiences, oftentimes it's to, for extroverted thinking, get something specific done. For extroverted feeling, it's to emotionally connect with other people and get needs met. So they also offer, but they do it in more of a structured way. They don't necessarily offer the individualistic side of that data or those emotions.
So just to get a reference point again, if you've been listening along and this is maybe your first time you've heard any of this, it can be difficult to get your head around all these different concepts, introverted this and extroverted that. Remember, we're talking about there are 4 decision-making processes, or they're technically called judging functions, that we as humans will use in our personalities. Now, you're going to have 2 of those in your personality type. So when you have a personality type, you're going to have 2 of those functions in what's called your cognitive function stack. There's also 4 what's technically called perceiving functions. We're not talking about those at all, but that's how you take in information. That's how you absorb information and take in the data around you and learn about your world and, basically perceive the world that you go through. We're not really talking about those today. So just understand we're talking about half the picture here in determining your personality type, and that's the reference point of where we're at.
Yeah. All right, so let's move on to the compare contrast of the 2 introverted decision-making or judging processes and the 2 extroverted ones. So let's take introverted thinking, which of course is used by TPs again, and introverted feeling, which is used by FPs. Let's look at those in contrast to each other, because this is a big one. A lot of times perceivers have difficulty knowing whether or not they're a thinker or a feeler because they're unsure of which of those 2 judging processes that they favor or use. Now, one of the easiest ways to see the difference between these 2 is to remember that introverted feeling is particularly interested in how people are feeling and how they're feeling, whereas introverted thinking is particularly interested in how they're thinking and how other people are thinking. And this can get kind of confusing because what's the difference between what you're feeling and what you're thinking, right? Especially if what you're feeling isn't particularly emotional. Is this just a matter of trying to suss out like a person's perspective on something or what's important to them? Because both of them, both introverted feeling and introverted thinking, create characteristics and virtues around, having these processes. It's not like introverted feeling is the only one with a conscience. Introverted thinking can also have that as well. So what are some of the biggest differences between the 2? If you're struggling to figure out what you're tapping into, if you're struggling to tap into whether or not you're focused on a person's emotions or if you're focused on a person's thought processes. And sometimes this can be difficult to suss out because our thoughts bleed into our emotions and our emotions bleed into our thoughts. And so it might be difficult to figure out which, if you're a perceiver, which one of these 2 worlds are you particularly fascinated by or interested in or tapping into. And we've discovered through our own exploration of, because we're both ENPs, so that means we have the same dominant or driver process of extroverted intuition, but we have very different co-pilots. And so over time, Joel and I have sort of shared notes on how our processes are working and figured out some really interesting distinctions and phenomena that is unusual to introverted feeling versus introverted thinking. I think the first one is that introverted feeling is it's very plugged into this concept of intent. And actually, Joel, would you be willing to kind of talk a little bit about introverted feeling's relationship with intent?
Yeah, I think because it's so interested in the human experience, and because it's not a strength necessarily of getting things done in the outer world, often what it looks to for its decisions is either inside intent, or if it's looking at other people, it's really focused in on the intent of others. So it really doesn't matter what the action was. What did the person intend? What was the reason behind why they may have taken that action? And I think what they're looking for, what an introverted feeling or authenticity person is looking for, what I'm looking for when I'm looking at somebody else, is not so much the behavior, the action. I look at that and I go, okay, what was the reason for that behavior or action? I mean, were they really being a bad person in the mistake they made? Maybe that was just a mistake. Maybe they had good intention. And so I'm really looking down to the heart. What did they intend to do? And the reason why that's important is because if, from my perspective, and I think from a lot of introverted feeling perspective, from authenticity, if someone has good intent, mostly it's going to turn out okay. Mostly you're going to have good results in the world because you're trying to do things with the proper intent or the good intent behind it. And if it doesn't work out well, it's not like you're a bad person, so it lets people off the hook of being, characterized as a bad guy or a criminal or something that's evil or wrong or something you got to avoid. It's that intent piece that's so important.
Well, and you could see why this would become really important to introverted feeling, because its polarity opposite is extroverted thinking, which is making things happen in the outside world. And if extroverted thinking as an FP is your 10-year-old or your 3-year-old process, then you might make mistakes just because you don't have as much acumen at making those things, happen as elegantly as they could. And so if you tried to make something happen in the outside world, but you just made a mistake or flubbed up, but you knew your intent was good, that's what you want people to be judging you on, is your intent, not your, whether or not you made a mistake. And so you're going to give that generosity to everybody else as well, as you're going to look at them based on their intent. Introverted thinking doesn't really look at intent very much. And I think it's because it kind of understands that everybody has a mixed bag of intent. Nobody has 100% altruistic good intent, and nobody has 100% evil, malevolent, bad intent. It's always a mixed bag. And so intent doesn't really matter to introverted thinking. Like, you still did the thing, right? The things still happened. We still have to deal with the aftermath and the cleanup, and we still have to figure all this out. So intent is not nearly as important to introverted thinking. But what I have noticed is super important to introverted thinking, or accuracy, is whether or not a person was thoughtful about it, whether or not they had good thought processes, as in, what is the kind of philosophy or maybe even thought algorithm that they've been plugging in? Are they careful about how they're thinking? Are they taking in a lot of information and data and really sort of getting in there and trying to figure out what truly makes sense? Do they have good thought processes? Are they filled with cognitive dissonance? Are they filled with bias? Those are the things that introverted thinking is looking at, because it also recognizes that we all come to kind of erroneous conclusions sometimes. None of us have perfect logic. But if our thought processes are good, then we probably, most of the time, we'll probably come to some pretty good conclusions. And to introverted thinking, what we're thinking, how we believe, what our paradigms are, the kinds of thoughts that we're having are the single most powerful thing in the human species, because our behavior comes from our thoughts. When we see the world in a certain way, we're going to behave toward the world in a certain way. And so to introverted thinking, the most refined thoughts are the most important thing. To introverted feeling, the most refined intent, trying to be a good person. And I think it's in part because introverted feeling is so in touch with all the complexity of humanity and all the different parts of who we are, that it knows that it also has bad intent in there. There's some evil lurking in every human being. So to introverted feeling, the struggle is to fight that tendency and to become good. And everybody who's on the path of trying to stay good is somebody that you're going to cut some slack towards, because there's evil that everybody has to fight. To introverted thinking, everybody has some jacked up viewpoints on something. Everybody's got something that they're kind of emotionally attached to, some thought process that has them showing up as kind of an idiot sometimes. And so you kind of cut people slack when they come to erroneous conclusions, but the important thing is, are you trying to refine your thoughts? Are you trying to become smarter all the time? Are you trying to collect more data and information to be a better thinker? And are you trying to find the best thought processes? So to introverted feeling, the most powerful thing in the world is having good intent and a good heart, trying to do the right thing. To introverted thinking, the most powerful thing in the world is whether or not you are trying to refine your thinking, whether or not you're trying to have good thoughts, whether or not you are trying to get away from cognitive dissonance and cognitive bias, because thoughts are more powerful than anything else.
Both introverted thinking and introverted feeling are process focused. Because they're introverted decision-making processes or judging functions, they're focused on the internal decisions, the internal alignment. So it's not so much focused on the outcome. That's an extroverted thinking and feeling framework. They're more interested in the process of how you get to the outcome. So it's the process focus that they're zoomed in on. Again, FI or introverted feeling is focused in on the intent process, and introverted thinking is focused in on the thought process, right? The clean thinking. So let's shift now and contrast that with the extroverted judging functions, which are way more focused on the outcome than they are on the process, because they're extroverted, something to try to get a measurable result in the outside world, whether that's through resource and management of resource and timelines like extroverted thinking, or whether that's through harmonious relationships and people-centric things like extroverted feeling. Both of these processes are also judging processes. We also make decisions with them as humans. But again, they're focused not on process, but on outcome. And I think some of the biggest distinctions here, if you want to look between extroverted thinking, we've nicknamed it effectiveness, or extroverted feeling, we've nicknamed it harmony. Extroverted thinking is very proactive in how it wants to set up systems in the outside world to be preventative and to be self-sustaining. So extroverted thinking is looking for managing an immense amount of resource to get an objective, and oftentimes a replicable objective that can be done over and over in the most effective way possible. Extroverted feeling is way more responsive as a cognitive function. It's looking way more to get people's needs met. And by definition, you can't get someone's needs met very far in advance because you don't know when that need might arise. And so extroverted feeling has to be more responsive to get its result in the outside world, which is harmony. It wants people to have a great experience, to live in harmony, and to get rid of discord.
Right. So it's sometimes difficult to determine the difference between these two because a lot of times we sort of conflate this idea of extroverted feeling being, empathetic. And extroverted thinking is very cold and distant. But the truth is that everybody who uses extroverted thinking also has that polarity opposite of introverted feeling. And so I've actually noticed that people who use extroverted thinking are very much tapped into a sense of empathy. And that's why it can be sometimes confusing whether or not somebody is using extroverted thinking or extroverted feeling, because we've attributed to them these characteristics that are not exclusive, right? Because every human being can be empathetic. It's not just coming from a single cognitive function. So sometimes just having virtues that we've assigned or attributed to these different processes or functions, if a person evidences that virtue, then we miscategorize that as as having come from a specific function. So if you're trying to figure out if you're using extroverted thinking or extroverted feeling, being empathetic is not that great of a way to determine that. But what we have noticed is, as Joel mentioned, it's really about how tapped in you are to being proactive, like you mentioned, or being responsive. And as Joel mentioned, when you're using extroverted feeling, you can be proactive to a certain extent, right? You can set up conditions that you're pretty sure will get everybody's needs met. This is where party planning comes in, right? If you plan the party well enough, everybody's going to have a good time. But the party planner doesn't leave once it's been set up. They have to stay. And the reason why they have to stay is because they have to continue to check in with all the people at the party to determine whether or not they were successful, because it's not like they just set up a system and left, right? And whatever happens, happens. They have to continually be checking in with people to make sure their needs are getting met, because human beings are fickle, right? And all sorts of things can throw people's morale off or throw the party off or whatever. Two people come in and they're fighting in front of everybody else, and now everybody's got low morale. So it doesn't matter how beautiful the context was. It doesn't matter how amazing the food was. It doesn't matter how great the alcohol's flowing. If two people come in fighting, it's going to ruin the mood. So a person who uses harmony, in using party planning as an illustration, They have to continually keep their finger on the pulse of the situation in order to ensure that the needs are getting met in real time to some extent. They have to be responsive to the human beings and all the complexities that human beings bring to each context and situation. So if you're trying to determine which one you are, ask yourself how much you believe that it's your job to not just set up a system, but stick around to make sure the system works. Whereas extroverted thinking will frequently, as consultants for companies, they'll come in, they'll go, these are the things you're missing, they'll set up a system, and then they'll go, let me know if it breaks, right? They're only responsive to when the system needs maintenance. But systems are a little bit easier to control usually than human beings are. So they try to take into, to consideration how humans will impact the system, but it's really more about the system. And they're actually trying to get rid of people who would impact the system negatively. One of the things you'll see an effectiveness person do if they maybe come into a new company is they'll start getting rid of people who they think are impacting the system negatively, because it's more important to preserve the system than it is to preserve the individual. Whereas for harmony, it's the opposite. The system is only facilitating the individuals. So it's much more important to preserve the person instead of preserving the system, unless the person is messing it up for everybody else. If the individual is messing it up for all the other people, then that person has to get removed from the system.
Let's look at a metaphor here that's a non-human metaphor, just to get a quick example of this. Imagine a garden situation where the extroverted thinking or effectiveness person or thought ideas, right? The person that's using this thought process comes in and sets the irrigation lines, creates the fence structure, sets up the roadways between maybe like the rows of apples you're going to plant, or the different flowers and different plants you're going to plant, and even determines where those plants are going to go and sets that entire system up. And that's kind of almost in a way of how extroverted thinking operates. It sets the system up. And then when those plants begin to grow and they need to be tended to, they need to be pruned and tended to and nurtured over time and then ultimately harvested. Almost imagine like extroverted feeling taking over that operation. It's a much more responsive role in the garden. So extroverted thinking is setting up the systems, and those should be continually working. Irrigation will irrigate all those plants around the clock, or on the time schedule it's been set up to. And if it barring any kind of frozen pipes or anything, that system should run for a long period of time before it has to be maintained. Whereas plants are unpredictable. They grow in different patterns. You might have something that gets sick. Maybe bugs are eating the leaves on it, and you have to tend that. You've got to figure out what to do to nurture that plant as it grows. So almost see the garden metaphor as a way you can see the difference between these two thought processes.
And that's a great illustration to also point out that extroverted feeling usually has a higher tolerance for chaos than extroverted thinking does. Because extroverted thinking's desire is to one and done it, right? A system you can just plug in and not have to think about it again it's the path to freedom. Whereas with extroverted feeling, it knows that that's never really possible because humans are constantly creating chaos. And so they have a much higher tolerance for chaos when you're using extroverted feeling than you do when you're using extroverted thinking. So also ask yourself, at what level does chaos become overwhelming to me as a person? And I've noticed extroverted feeling actually has the ability to hold a lot more chaos. Their threshold is much higher. And so when you're looking at all of these functions, these judging functions, it's important to remember, like Joel said, it's important to remember that the introverted judging processes are more about how something occurs as opposed to what occurs. Whereas the extroverted judging processes of extroverted feeling and extroverted thinking are more tapped into what's going on. How is the setup working? What's happening in the outside world? And also, remember, going back to the beginning, because extroverted thinking and extroverted feeling are more focused on the outside world, they believe all thoughts and feelings are actionable. I'm supposed to take action on these things now. Whereas the introverted judging processes, introverted feeling and introverted thinking, because they're not as focused on how it's impacting the outside world and they're more focused on what's happening internally, they don't believe every feeling or thought is actionable. It's about gaining greater and greater fidelity. It's about gathering more and more information to eventually, in the post-processing, make a decision. So how quickly are you acting on the information? How quickly is your judging function encouraging you to behave toward this piece of information you got, or this emotional information you got? Do you feel like you have to immediately act on it, or do you feel like you get to just kind of sit with it and use it as one more piece of fidelity in order to make a better decision later? And that will help you determine which of these judging functions you're using.
Now, there's a whole, again, separate piece of this, which are your perceiving functions we didn't talk about today, but there's a whole nother layer to that. Again, I recommend, if you've been listening to this and you've been following along pretty well, but you'd like more information, personalityhacker.com, you can look at that CAR model and understand how these functions work in your, what's called your cognitive function stack, based on your 4-letter code of your Myers-Briggs personality.
Now, this podcast is intended to not be a way to diagnose your type. Think of it as the next phase of trying to figure out your best fit type after, say, you've taken some tests. If you've taken some personality tests online and you've come up with a couple different types, they're usually, I don't see anybody who comes up with a radically different type every time they take the test. That'd be a little schizophrenic. Usually you've got it pared down to like 2 or 3 different types, or maybe even just 2, like you're going back and forth between 2. Figure out what the cognitive function stack is for those 2 types, or what's, the car model, the passengers in the car model, the driver, the co-pilot, the 10-year-old and 3-year-old. Find out what those are. We have resources at personalityhacker.com that will tell you what each of those positions are for each of the types. And then once you find those out, then ask yourself how that decision-making or judging process, what's my relationship to it? Do I feel like it's really matching me? Does it feel like I'm really using introverted feeling and it's more about people's emotional experience and I'm super focused on intent, and intent is really important to me, and I understand all the complexities of the human spirit and that we're all so evil, and so intent's super important? Or do I find myself having like a really strong relationship with thoughts and how people are thinking, and that if people are thinking the right thoughts or have the right thought processes, then they'll come to rational conclusions and that we'll see a better world because of it. And it's not about intent. It's more about how rigorous people are with their thought processes. Versus, do I find myself having to take action on every piece of information I have, and so therefore I'm kind of reluctant to share information with other people because all information is actionable and I'm trying to create these systems that are proactive. Versus, I feel like all emotions are actionable. Every time I hear somebody explain an emotional experience, I believe that I need to get a need met. And also, I'm constantly checking in with people to determine what their emotional spirit is, right? Their morale, because I need to be taking action to make sure that I keep their morale up and get their needs met. So this is a part of the process. This isn't the beginning or the end of it. Just think of it as a tool to help you on your journey of finding your best fit type.
The reason why this is so important to us to talk about finding your best fit type is because often we see people, maybe like you, that get stuck. I don't know if this is true for you or not, but they get stuck in constantly trying to figure out their type or get more nuance around what type they are and all the distinctions that might be. And so one of our passions is helping you discover that sooner rather than later, because just discovering how you're wired can be really helpful. It can help you with a lot of things in your life and kind of give you a starting point for your personal growth journey. But that's the point, is a personal growth journey. And so if you can find your type sooner rather than later, it enables you then to have a good launching pad for what we believe is the actual work that needs to be done, which is saying, okay, like for myself example, I'm an ENFP. What does that mean? How can I best grow myself? How can I best show up to the world, honoring who I truly am, and also becoming the best version of myself and continually pushing myself to become better and better and better? That's the point of why getting your type is important. It's not just so you have an accurate type. It's so you can launch into a personal growth journey. So we want to hear from you. You've been here with us on the podcast. Come over to personalityhacker.com. Go right below this podcast and you can leave a comment, ask a question. Let's get a discussion started around this topic, and let's share with the community, because we've got a community of like minds growing here, some of these ideas. Share with us where you're at in discovering your type. Maybe you've already fully discovered your type, but you went through this process on your own to have your best fit type discovered. You went through some of the different distinctions we talked about today. Paint us a picture, tell us a story. Let us know how that worked out for you. And if you're still in the journey, it's a great place to ask questions. In fact, I'd also encourage you to come over to facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack. Join the conversation there too, because there's a community of people that are willing and able to help discover which type you might be.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, you can subscribe to us on iTunes and various Android platforms. And if you're feeling particularly giving, if this was helpful for you to find your best fit type, then you can leave us a rating and review. That helps us out a lot.
Yeah, my name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we will talk with you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.